Hello, in this video I want to continue the series that we were doing with Baudrillard and space privatization. I really enjoyed doing this series because I feel like there are honestly a lot of really interesting ways to develop Baudrillard in a myriad of ways on this resolution, and I definitely think that in these videos I can definitely show a lot of the flexibility that Baudrillard has in terms of how some of the arguments that may not fit so well in other resolutions or that may be a bit awkward in terms of their execution might actually fit in the context of like what Baudrillard is talking about and how we kind of respond to political questions such as the resolution. I think there are a lot of really interesting ways to kind of like talk about specifically what we'll be doing in this video, which is developing how we think about Baudrillard being read on the affirmative in the context of space privatization, because I think that kind of like what I said, if you watch the settler colonialism series that I did or the Afro-pessimism series that I did, the particular way that the resolution is written means that there are a lot of ways in which you can kind of like get away with not having to win, that there should be some type of like alternative usage for space or some type of like ethical public usage of space, but just that the use of private space is immoral or unethical. And I think there are a lot of really interesting ways that teams from the perspective of Baudrillard can really get to this point, and ways that still kind of like get to a lot of the nuance and criticisms of the ways in which the resolution is kind of like pointing to the space as a particular set of like images and simulacra that can be produced in order to kind of like sanitize the way that we relate to and think about the status quo, but also a lot of the ways in which the kind of like methodology that people often read with Baudrillard can kind of be generative in this case for the way it produces really imaginative ways of like using the resolution and thinking about particular ways to kind of like mess around with like different ways of thinking about like what type of terms that you can like enact the resolution on. And so the first place I kind of want to start for this video is just thinking about what are some of the kind of like priorities when you're making this argument, or what is kind of the best form of what Baudrillard looks like on the affirmative on this resolution. I think that Baudrillard on this particular resolution is a really good idea because I think that there are a lot of really good arguments to make about mimicry in the context of this resolution. I feel like there are a lot of ways in which like Baudrillard teams could like simulate or fiat the idea of like a lot of like privatized space enterprises failing, or kind of like defending the kind of like destruction or failure of certain technology in space and things like that, and all those things be part of the way in which you kind of like demoralize or are able to make critiques of the way in which space privatization happens, right? There are a lot of arguments to make about like how particular type of like policies that would, for instance, like ban particular types of ideas could be things that you have to defend at like a particular basis of like material impacts, but that you defend just on the basis of why mimicking the way in which the state would do such a thing can actually invigorate conversations about how particular forms of space privatization actually show up as immoral and are kind of like used not as a way to like persuade the public in order to create a particular form of action, but actually to dissuade the public from believing that state power actually has the ability to operationalize these types of constraints. And I think there are a lot of ways in which you could kind of like play on both the duality of the kind of like privatized part of the resolution being something that should be kind of like rejected, but also the idea that the state is kind of like holding hands or like in cooperation with this kind of like privatized force, and why those things kind of like represent a necessity for kind of like doing a mimicry of what the state's power would actually look like in terms of how it would operationalize the resolution, or a kind of like simulation of the failures of what a privatized space enterprise would look like. And I think there are a lot of arguments to look at in terms of like why looking at things from the perspective of like how that kind of like failure is able to operationalize itself in political imagination is kind of necessary in order to check back against the way in which like politics has kind of been sanitized by the imagery of like this united public being able to like access a particular like relationship to space, or development of a particular type of like way of like relating to space that kind of like allows for this kind of like unison mobility into a new set of like survivable terms for like humanity as a whole. And I think that being able to kind of like critique the terms of like those kind of like positive notions of being able to use space from this perspective could be really interesting ways for you to play with like the role that maybe like spaces like debate serves, and why these academic spaces are either valuable or invaluable for being able to act out like these forms of failure, and being able to kind of like send us back to the drawing board in terms of like what we're thinking about actually checks those kind of like private forces of power. I then think that when you kind of like switch these concerns into how you would answer things like particular types of case arguments, I think that outside of like basically having a lot of the most generic debates that people have about Baudrillard in terms of just like your general theories of communication being false, I think there are a lot of arguments to be made about like why in terms of like specificity, space is a particular set of resolutions where cultural imagery is particularly prevalent and powerful in the way in which we have like thought about the development of our future in technology in relationship to like what is beyond the limitations. I think that there are so many arguments to make about like how various types of projects have been tied to like ideas that are like latent in science fiction, or how the kind of like idea of like what types of cultural images are produced in terms of what we want the future to look like, and how it's kind of like automated, how it kind of like accelerates us towards like more hyper-capitalist like relationships to the future, and all those things are really, really good and prevalent in the context of space, because I feel like there's so many arguments about like how even the kind of like privatized forces that exist in the status quo are only like inspired by or able to kind of like operationalize these things through the imagery that is found in kind of like the coercive way in which like governmental, various other sources have been able to kind of like operationalize this imagery in order to like get the public on board with this type of like expansion, etc., and use it to sanitize and erase like various other conflicts that happen like around us. And I think that being able to like make those types of specific nuanced analysis in the context of this resolution can help you kind of like prove a lot of the kind of like criticisms wrong that are kind of like more broadly about the questions of like how Baudrillard operates in like public settings and policies broadly, because of like their lack of particular arguments about the relationship between that and the way in which you're kind of like considering the power of imagery, and especially in the context of space, where futurism and things like that are so kind of like latently powerful in the kind of like literature bases that are used to kind of discuss and make this science possible. I did think that kind of like transitioning into how you're able to answer a lot of framework and T questions, I definitely think there's so many ways for you to kind of like play with like really funky interpretations of like what the resolution should look like, and why like particular ways of fiating the resolution have already done it wrong, and why yours is like even more in line with like the actual kind of like reading of the resolution than maybe like some more fiated terms. I think that making arguments about like why the kind of like debate that forces the question of how we restrict privatized space cooperation only at the level of like it's like a, kind of like material impacts, or the idea of like its material instantiations, doesn't actually do justice to the way in which those conversations have already been used as like the kind of like basis for being able to sanitize various forms of like localized violence that have happened historically, starting from like the Cold War and like kickstarting like where space imagery really comes from and becomes part of like the public's like image, and like how the public is kind of thinking about sorting itself in relationship to exploration outside of Earth. And I think making arguments about like why the kind of like core historical kind of like nature of the topic is actually more suited in the theory that you're kind of speaking of, and the more you're able to kind of like push some of these central core thesis arguments, the easier it is for you to win, that you're actually closer to the core of what the resolution is asking than like what more kind of like fiat or state-based interpretations of what fiat of what the state and other kind of like actors are supposed to do in the face of the resolution. And I think there are really interesting ways in which you can kind of like make those distinctions really helpful in terms of like messing with why things like the kind of procedural norms that they're trying to uphold and things like that have gone so far to the point where they actually overturn like the spirit of the resolution itself, and allows you to kind of play into arguments about like how things like procedural arguments are part of the kind of continuation of a system of simulacra that you're kind of critiquing, per all of the arguments that you're making about space and other places and other parts of the flow. And so hopefully this video has been helpful for you, for giving you a basis of ideas of what you could do with reading Baudrillard and the app from this particular resolution, and hopefully you'll tune in for more videos I'll be doing like this. And yeah, thank you as always for watching.